There are certainly domestic industry concerns in India that China is swallowing up the Indian market, swallowing up the Indian industry, that this is a kind of neo-imperialism. How would you respond to those concerns? Because okay, the one thing that China is not open about, when you're suggesting that India's economy should be open and to be protectionist is actually protecting vested interests. What about democracy? What about political and civil liberties? And I ask this because there's a huge question around, for example, China's treatment of its Muslim population, and this is a story that never even gets addressed, never even gets spoken about.
Yeah, and I think many Indians, if you don't mind me saying this, can be very naive about geopolitics. Geopolitics is not about friendship. Geopolitics is not about whether they like you or love you. Geopolitics is all about what's in my interest, and that's what they will do. In international affairs, I always believe that the biggest problem is when you get emotional, right? Mm-hmm. And if Pakistan was a complete vassal state of China, why does it go to the IMF when it needs assistance, right? It's a vassal state of China. It should say, to hell with the IMF, to hell with all that. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Says China wants to push India into a war and then it will crush India. There is a sense, what you call the marathon competition on between India and China. Yeah. There is a sense that there's room for only one winner here, right? Yeah. And
the best, if you can imagine a seesaw, okay? On one side, the seesaw is China. On the other side, the seesaw is United States, right? The seesaw is going like this. What's the best position for India to be in the middle? So wherever India puts its foot, the seesaw goes that way. And guess what? Both United States and China will be super nice to India. That's about being cunning.
What you just heard was an exchange between renowned Indian journalist Barkha Dutt and veteran Singaporean diplomat Professor Kishore Mahbubani. This full conversation took place in December of 2020, just months after India and China had engaged in their deadliest border clash in decades. Against this tense backdrop, an interrogation over how India should deal with China began. In the content that follows, you will witness an extraordinary dialogue. The host will repeatedly question, from the perspective of India's national sentiment, territorial sovereignty, and security anxieties, whether China is an expansionist and untrustworthy neighbor. Professor Mahbubani, in response, will use his signature cold-blooded realism to try, again and again, to pull the conversation away from emotion and back to interests. He will use the wisdom of Vietnam, the hypocrisy of the West, and the success stories of Southeast Asia to offer India a completely different strategic framework. Is this a futile dialogue of the deaf, or a dose of thought-provoking bitter medicine? This is a rare and deep conversation that helps us understand the complex psychology behind the India-China relationship. Let's continue.
But yes, from an Indian perspective, you've seen the Chinese apps that have been banned. You've seen the kind of cold freeze in relations. There's definitely a view on the Chinese aggression and incursion. And I'm just asking you to contextualize how you think the return of Asia is possible with our countries at loggerheads.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think if India and China go at loggerheads with each other, then the Asian century is gone. It's gone. Yeah. Finished. Yeah. And so it's very important that China and India get their relations right. And as you know, all of Asia wants China and India to get their relations right. And it's important for China and India to step back and ask themselves what is really, really important to their people today. Is it really that important whether you succeed in getting a few square miles of territory at the border? Or is it more important for both your countries to do well? And so if both countries can step back and say, okay, we have more important issues to do, and there are ways and means of diffusing these issues. So, and I hope that both sides will make an effort to try and diffuse the issues. But as you know, the reason why this problem has happened for 2,000 years, one reason why China and India lived in peace is because the Himalayas were so formidable There's no way that armies could cross the Himalayas. It's impossible. They were massive. But today, with modern technology, both sides can build roads up to the limit. Both sides can have helicopter flights to the close to each other, and that's how this friction is happening over territory that is contested by both sides. So it's very important that both sides make a huge effort to say how important is the border issue relative to other issues, and that's
Yeah.
what I would encourage both sides to do.
But as a diplomat, you can make that comment. But as you would know from having served at the highest levels of government in your own country, a government can only act in response to public opinion. And what you call a sort of a few square miles of territory would be India defining its territorial integrity. Countries have gone to war for less. So I just don't feel as sanguine as you do about India and China getting into the same lane. I think at the moment they're not even on parallel lanes. They're on a possible collision course. Things may have quietened down, but we came very, very near to a military escalation, and we still have hundreds of thousands of troops eyeball to eyeball. And how do we look away from that fact? And if you were talking to friends in India, what is it that you'd be saying to them?
Well, I would say learn from best examples from all over the world. And, India, of course, has only recently fought a war with China in 1962. Let me give
Yeah.
you the example of Vietnam. Vietnam has been, in one way or another, fighting China for 2,000 years. Vietnam was occupied by China 1,000 years. The biggest war that's been fought in recent years was between China and Vietnam, where you had a few 100,000 soldiers fighting each other. And then from 1979 to 1990, that was the most militarized border in the world and full of mines and artillery and everything. Now, that was 1990. Today, you go to the border, there are no mines, there is no artillery, there are no more few 100,000 troops. It doesn't mean Vietnam and China have fallen in love with each other. I can assure you the Vietnamese are as distrustful of the Chinese as they have been for 2,000 years. But now that border is one of the most heavily traded borders in the world. So it is possible to go from a situation where you've been enemies and you've had few 100,000 soldiers actually not just face each other, but fight each other as recently as 1979. And today you have a border that is frankly one of the most peaceful borders in the world. Even after, by the way, Vietnam claims that China has stolen some islands from Vietnam. You see?
So, yeah, no, I see the larger point of what you're saying, but I want to pick up on trade, right? You spoke about this being one of the most traded borders in the world. Now, when you talk about trade between India and China, there are people who will point to the trade deficit. India has chosen to stay out of the RCEP agreement, the regional free trade agreement that it was negotiating, in fact, to be part of. And then because of what's happened at the border, I think that had a big impact on it. But there are also those who see China's economic policies as predatory. You've heard that language, in fact, used by people who served in the Trump administration. There are certainly domestic industry concerns in India that China is swallowing up the Indian market, swallowing up the Indian industry, that this is a kind of neo-imperialism. How would you respond to those concerns? Because you mentioned trade as a defining basis of Vietnam and China. And if it were to be that for India and China, I think there would be an outcry in India.
Just give me 10 seconds. I'm going to show you something. 10 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so that's Kishore Mahbubani, who's, I think, going to get us something. You can see his book at the shelf behind has China One, who seems to have a very pragmatic sort of understanding of what he thinks India should do next.
Just
yeah, go
2
ahead.
hours ago,
Yeah,
just let me see, it's 9 o'clock, sorry. 5 hours ago,
yeah,
the Prime Minister of Singapore launched this book,
yeah.
India on Our Minds.
Right.
Okay?
Yep. Yeah.
And he spoke. And you know what he said? He said, we will always keep the door open for India to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I can tell you, everybody in East Asia would love to have India back into the regional comprehensive economic partnership. And I want to emphasize the regional comprehensive economic partnership is not one country called China. There are 15 countries in it, not just including some of India's best friends. Japan is there, Australia is there in the regional comprehensive economic partnership. And I want to, and if you don't, if I hope you don't mind if I want India to succeed. I want India to do well. I mean, I want to emphasize that, okay?
Yeah.
My mother was a very fervent Indian nationalist. So obviously I want India to do well. But at the same time, as a student of geopolitics for 50 years, the worst thing that a country can do in the game of geopolitics is to get emotional and irrational. It's very, very important to be very cold-blooded and calculating in your analysis. And let me emphasize the one important point. The geopolitical game today is no more about aircraft carriers, fighter jets. It's not about that anymore. It's about the size of your economy. And that's the most important thing you need to do. And the lesson that you've seen from India's experience, when did India have the biggest growth phase? In the 1990s, after Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia opened up your economy, right? And look what happened. You became a tiger, right?
Right.
So the Indians are the most competitive economic animals in the world. The Indians can compete anywhere in the world. And you see that in the United States, the most competitive laboratory in the world is the United States of America, which is the most successful ethnic community in the United States is the ethnic Indian community. So clearly what you need to do, the lesson that we have learned is you have to open up your economy and compete. Even if you have a short-term pain, you get long-term gain. And competition, capitalism is about creative destruction. And if you prevent creative destruction, you prevent long-term growth. So I'm being very brutal about this because at the end of the day, India can compete. I have great confidence India can compete. And you mentioned the RCEP. They know that out of 15 countries, you have problem with one country. You can negotiate a bilateral safeguards agreement, and I think you can work something out with China to do that. But you have the other 14 countries that still want to trade with you.
Okay, let me be a bit provocative. We had a comment on our live stream saying that it's like modern colonialism, and I remind you, and since you mentioned that your mother was a fervent Indian nationalist, that the British project of India started with the East India Company. So trade is often the precursor to a certain kind. Now, no one is suggesting that this is going to be territorial capture, but there is a sense in India of the capture of the markets by China, right? And I think that while you can say be cold, be brutal, any Indian government has to be mindful of what's happening to its own economy. There is no country in the world that doesn't have elements of some protectionism. I mean, there's what China is doing with Australia, for example, right? There are tariff wars between China and Australia as well. So is it as simple as you make it sound?
Okay, you're right. It's very good to be very frank. Are you protecting the poor people of India? Or are you protecting the rich people of India? And I will argue with you that in India's refusal to join the RCEP, and I'll be very brutal about this, is because you have some very rich vested interests that will suffer. And so you have a choice. So if you want to help the poor people of India, and by the way, the record of is I want to emphasize you, there's 650 million people in Southeast Asia. The country that has been the most successful at poverty reduction in the entire human history is Vietnam. Vietnam was at war for 50 years, okay? Non-stop, 50 years, 1939 to 1989. And then it stopped. You know what Vietnam did? Vietnam opened up its economy. Vietnam integrated with the rest of the world. Vietnam accepted the creative destruction. And I can tell you the World Bank President Kim said, no country has reduced poverty as fast as Vietnam has. So forget China. why doesn't India look at other countries? Look at Indonesia. Indonesia's population is 250 million, right? Indonesia, by the way, is far behind India in economic development. And guess what? They opened up and they're growing, right? So the lesson is very clear. Are you going to protect a few vested interests who are very prosperous? Or are you going to help the bottom 50% in India? And you want to help the bottom 50% in India? Forget China. Learn from Vietnam. Vietnam is a good friend of India.
Okay, the one thing that China is not open about, when you're suggesting that India's economy should be open and to be protectionist is actually protecting vested interests. What about democracy? What about political and civil liberties? And I ask this because there's a huge question around, for example, China's treatments of its Muslim population, and this is a story that never even gets addressed, never even gets spoken about. We saw a shocking story on Al Jazeera this week, which spoke about Muslims in internment camps being forced to eat pork every Friday as part of what's called re-education. Do civil liberties not matter at all? When it comes to India, the whole world comments. When it comes to China, everybody's quiet.
Well, I think, as you know, India was very upset when Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday made some comments
about the farmer protest. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we in Asia are wiser than the West is. And just to put in a big historical context, I've been a student of the West for a long time. The West has lost its political domination. It has lost its economic domination. It only now has intellectual domination. And it preserves its intellectual domination by lecturing the whole world on human rights issues, when the West, as you know, is completely hypocritical on human rights issues. I'll give you a simple example. The European countries will condemn any country that carries out torture, right? If India carries out waterboarding, the European countries will be the first to insist that India stops waterboarding. But when the United States was the first major developed country to reintroduce torture, the European countries kept absolutely quiet. So on human rights, it's okay for NGOs to speak about it, because NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they're completely objective, neutral, and they don't carry an agenda of anybody. But whenever any government tries to criticize any country on human rights, I say they've got double standards, because they will only criticize their adversaries and not their friends. And just, since you mentioned how bad the human rights situation is in China, in the 1971, when the United States was fighting the evil Soviet Empire, it had a choice. It could either join the world's largest democracy in India to fight the Soviet Union, or it could fight the largest communist government in the world, which, by the way, under Mao, saw far greater human rights abuses than anything you have in China today, right? Far greater. And you know what? The great democracy, United States, chose China over India. And I think many Indians, if you don't mind me saying this, can be very naive about geopolitics. Geopolitics is not about friendship. Geopolitics is not about whether they like you or love you. Geopolitics is all about what's in my interest, and that's what they will do. And so I think it's important to, the European Union also wanted to impose human rights standards on India also. So that's what they've been doing all the time. So it's important in geopolitics to be, as I said, calculate what is in your interest and do what's in your interests.
But what happens then to civil liberties? I actually agree with you. I agree with you on the one point that you make, that a lot of commentary by the Western world is full of humbug and full of hypocrisy. I mean, I remember this time, for example, when Obama was on a presidential visit to India, and before going, he made a lot of comments about the constitutional sort of need to preserve pluralism in India, which of course is all true. But then he took the flight from here to Saudi Arabia, where he didn't say anything of the kind. So one does see all of these gaping double standards. But when you think of And I agree with you on that. But when you think of these Muslims in internment camps in China and you hear the horror stories that come out, should the world look the other way? And there are things, for example, when you look back at, let's say, apartheid and Africa, there have been moments in history when global pressure has pushed change. So, is your binary really sort of always applicable?
No. By the way, I want to emphasize that we should advance human rights.
Yeah.
Because, I don't want to live in a country where my nails are being pulled out, I don't like that.
Yeah.
But just since you mentioned apartheid, I mean,
Yeah.
you must surely know the reason why the apartheid regime was so resilient and could survive so many years is because United States and United Kingdom supported South Africa. I mean, I hope you know that.
Of course,
Apartheid,
there's the
and
whole
you know,
Margaret Thatcher
and you know
Thatcher's
that
the enormous pressure on Thatcher from the Commonwealth to actually impose those sanctions. But yeah,
and
go ahead.
and you know that the United States Congress declared Nelson Mandela a terrorist. And do you know that they only removed the terrorist title 6 years after apartheid ended? I mean, look at that. Look at that. So you tell me that United States is a defender of human. United States.
I don't care about the United States. I'm just asking how the world should react. The world is not the United States.
True. But at the same time, I completely agree with you. But as you know, if someone came to India and lectured India publicly and say, why did you tear down the mosque? Why do you do all that? You know, everyone's going to react very badly. But if I want to tell a friend of mine, right, hey, I think you're doing something wrong. If I broadcast it in the media, he's not going to change. But I know if I talk to him privately and try to talk to him, things will change. And I have seen in my lifetime so many countries where the human rights situation is improved dramatically. And I'm going to go back to Indonesia. In 1965, the estimates of the number of people killed after the coup is a few million, right? Few million, okay? Now, guess what? Look at Indonesia today, how it has improved. And you know how it has improved? And you want to know the real story? Do you know what? They elected a president, SBY, who studied in the US in a military college. And he learned the most important lesson. The role of the military is to be subservient to the civilian government. And Indonesia, which was a military-run government, right, for many years, like Pakistan, okay, suddenly changed. And how would that change happen? It's through quiet persuasion and through peer pressure. So all this grandstanding on Xinjiang is not going to get you anywhere. But if you want to change Chinese behavior on Xinjiang, and I would say, frankly, if it's about Muslims, don't you think the Muslim countries should take the lead? How is it that when the Western countries wrote a letter criticizing China, not one Muslim country supported that letter, not one. So it's better for the Muslims to go to China quietly, talk to China quietly, and see what can be done. And I believe that such quiet persuasion can make a difference. And I'll give you another example, okay, since many of your viewers may not believe me. For so many years, the West put sanction after sanction after sanction on Myanmar. What happened? Nothing, zero. What did ASEAN do? ASEAN said no sanctions. We will welcome Myanmar. Come join our family. But after joining ASEAN, Myanmar went from being a Syria, right, towards becoming a reasonably stable, well-balanced state today with no major civil wars. That's amazing. I mean, it's not perfect. But look at the transformation that we have done. So how do we do this? And I can tell you the Indonesian foreign minister who brought in Myanmar said the only way to do so, to transform people, is to talk to them privately. So I would say talk to the Chinese privately. Don't join the West in grandstanding.
But when you speak about the silence of the Muslim countries, one of the countries of the world that has remained silent is Pakistan, right?
Yes.
And from an Indian perspective, Pakistan now is seen almost as a kind of vassal state of China. And so when these border tensions, in fact, erupted, one of the things that the Indian military had to war game was for a possible two-front conflict, and it's always war game for that. But there's a kind of, Pakistan is sort of being seen as a continuum of China. How do you see that relationship? Obviously, for China, it's all about self-interest. For any nation, its choices are about self-interest. There, I agree with you. But from an Indian perspective, we're looking at this. We're looking at Pakistan occupied Kashmir. We're looking at the sort of one border, one road project, and we're going. Pakistan is just like now an addendum, almost an addendum to China.
Well, in international affairs, I always believe that the biggest problem is when you get emotional, right? And if Pakistan was a complete vassal state of China, why does it go to the IMF when it needs assistance, right? It's a vassal state of China. It should say to hell with the IMF, to hell with all that. I mean, that doesn't make sense. And so I would say that, it's a big mistake to use labels, okay?
Yeah.
And it's also important to ask yourself, again, if you don't mind me being very frank.
No, please.
Southeast Asia had as many divisions as South Asia has today. Indonesia had a confrontasi policy against Singapore and Malaysia. Indonesia blew up a bomb in the middle of Singapore's financial district, killing Singaporeans, right? A terrorist act. Thailand and Malaysia have fought over separatist provinces. Philippines claims a state in Malaysia. I mean, these are all still ongoing problems, by the way. You know what? Look at how we manage problems. You will always have problems between states. That's a given. The only question is how you manage those problems.
Right.
And I would say it's very important for South Asia to come to Southeast Asia and say, how is this in these countries? And the divisions in Southeast Asia are as serious as anybody is. Out of 650 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, and you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and communists. Southeast Asia is the most diverse region of planet Earth, which is why the British historians calls it the Balkans of Asia. And logically, the cultural differences in India are nothing. Nothing. And look at me. I mean, I grew up as a child. And even till today, the only reason I could write my book, Has China Won, is because I got to listen to Muhammad Rafi. And where was Muhammad Rafi born? In Lahore. And I went to see his house in Lahore, right? So you're telling me that the cultural difference within Pakistan and in India is that great? Come on. So if Southeast Asia, right, can overcome far greater differences, and the differences will be there. You can't change them. Don't believe that magically we will live in a fairy tale world where we'll all like each other a lot. No, we will never like each other. We'll be different. But you have to live in the real world. And in the real world, there are real success stories. And Southeast Asia, the most important thing about Southeast Asia, every Indian should know, and I've documented this in my book, ASEAN Miracle, 9 out of the 10 Southeast Asian states have an Indic base. And I can tell you in 2017 or 2016, please check, when Philippines, the world's largest Catholic country, Philippines, organized an East Asian summit, and when all the presidents were there, Obama and everyone were there, what did Philippines put on as a cultural presentation for the Philippines? The Ramayana. Aren't you shocked? The world's largest. So here in Southeast Asia, where you have Indic cultures, we are able to get along despite our differences. And frankly, South Asia should learn some lessons from Southeast Asia on how you manage differences. Because you're not going to change each other. You have to learn to accept that we are different And by the way, I know the Singapore and Malaysia, I can give you an example how neurotic it can be. We were married for 2 years. You're one country. Then you know what? We got separated. And then we continue to live in the same house. Can you imagine a divorced couple living in the same house? That's Singapore and Malaysia. But you want an example of good cooperation? Come to Singapore and Malaysia. So we have real success stories. So why does India always focus on problems of the past, on differences, and not focus on what can be done to learn lessons from others and learn to find a better way? There are better
So
ways.
how do you see, for example, the Pakistan-China equation?
Well, I think, geopolitics, as I told you earlier,
Yeah.
where just as the United States chose the world's largest communist country under Mao Zedong as a partner, countries don't care what your internal system is about. If it suits their geopolitical interests, they will work with the country. And right now, there's a convergence of geopolitical interests between Pakistan and China. So that's what happens. So, and just as there is, by the way, a convergence of geopolitical interests within India and United States today. That's what's happening also. And that is not driven by the fact that they like each other or believe in each other. It's about geopolitical interests. But I do believe, I'm going to say something that will shock you.
Go ahead. I'm pretty shock proof, but try me. Yeah.
Okay, that I can imagine a free trade agreement between China, India, and Pakistan that will benefit all three countries.
That does shock me, and I can't see it happening. I can't see it happening in my
I know.
lifetime.
You see, exactly.
Yeah.
But what I described to you is what has happened in East Asia. China and Vietnam are far greater adversaries. And look at the trade between Vietnam and China today. It's amazing. So, and at the end of the day, why is Vietnam doing this? Let me tell you what Vietnam is doing this. Vietnam is trading heavily with China, not because the Vietnamese love China. They are using China to make themselves strong in the same way that China used the United States to make itself strong. So you use your adversary to make yourself stronger. Now that's the best game of geopolitics you can play.
Okay, I have some questions for you on our live stream that I want to actually just pick up one by one. First is that Abhishek Singh says the onus of resolving the differences between India and China at the moment should be on China. Why blame India?
I'm sorry. I can only help you by being very frank. I've studied geopolitics for 50 years. I don't know of any geopolitical dispute where one side is 100% right and the other side is 100% wrong.
There are acts of aggression. There are acts of military aggression that are recorded. I mean, that the British were colonialists is a recorded fact. That there are, I'm just giving you one example. So I'm saying there are everything is not normative. Some things are empirical.
No, so as you know, in the case of China and India, the border dispute, you also know that 3 times the Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, proposed to India, we will never be able to figure this all out, this border dispute. Why not just accept the line as it is and settle as it is? And as you know, 3 times India turned China down. That's also a fact. And frankly, I think it was unwise to turn down that offer. It was very unwise because that would have settled the matter. And as you know, China has settled its border disputes with Russia, with Vietnam, with Mongolia, with everybody else. It's settled. So it is possible to do a deal. And I think it's important, therefore, to figure out at the end of the day, if you want to succeed, you got to figure out what are my bigger, more fundamental interests. And this is a marathon race between China and India. It's a marathon race. We will know the winner 100 years from now. and the marathon race will be determined by who has the stronger economic legs. If your economic legs are weak, you will lose the race. If your economic legs are strong, you will win the race. And by the way, if India can achieve half the per capita income of Indians in the United States, India will have the world's largest economy by far.
Right.
So the potential for the Indian economy is number one in the world.
But
No
let me
country
push.
can match the economic potential of India.
But let me push you on this, on the free trade point that you make when you earlier said that India can compete with anybody. We have a question on our live stream from Sanjay who says, no, I don't agree. The free trade agreement between any country and China can only benefit China because trade with China is a one-way street.
Okay. By the way, trade can never be one way.
I think the point is that it's not a level
excuse me.
field.
You know something?
Yeah.
If it was all one way, you know what's going to happen? Nobody, if others don't benefit from trading with China, then they won't have money to buy goods from China. You know?
Yeah.
To buy goods from China. And by the way, if you look at Southeast Asia again, it's amazing that the Southeast Asian economies, which were behind China in so many ways, many of them have surplus with China. And by the way, it is possible to negotiate a free trade deal with China where the China will give you unilateral concessions temporarily to enable you to catch up in the competition. And China was very generous to Southeast Asia in giving what they call an early harvest in that.
So I want to give you a sense of how a lot of Indians feel, and that's why I'm picking up an emotional question, even though you spent a lot of time on the conversation saying the one thing you should never be in geopolitics is emotional. But this reflects how many Indians are thinking and feeling today. Nandita Ghosh on our stream says China wants to push India into a war and then it will crush India. There is a sense, what you call the marathon competition on between India and China. There is a sense that there's room for only one winner here. Right. And that is why the kind of sort of coexistence that you're speaking about, even though there are not the kind of historical conflicts that India has with Pakistan, with China. And, I remember Modi used to say before this border conflict that not one shot has been fired at these borders for decades. That unfortunately now doesn't apply. We're actually seeing a kind of, we've seen a military conflict. But how do you address this Indian apprehension, which is very real, which is very widespread? That now the narrative is it's not Pakistan, it's China that's the real adversary. It's China that has blocked, for example, UN sanctions against terror groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jamaat-e-Dawa. You've served as the president of the UN Security Council. You know what these concerns are about. So just address that concern that China does not even stand India on the issue of terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the question from Nandita Ghosh that China wants to push India into a war and then it can try to crush India. Yes. Sometimes some truths are very painful. The Chinese are very, very concerned about a war. But they're very concerned about a war with the United States. Very concerned. Right. Because the United States is clearly trying to push China down. I mean, that's obvious, for obvious reasons. And if you go to Beijing, and of course, I've been there a few times, and you mention India, they look very puzzled. Oh, really? They're concerned about us? Why? China, I was amazed at the indifference of the Chinese to India. Because for them, their number one threat, and by the way, there'll be a monumental struggle between US and China in the next 20 years. The Chinese have only one obsession. They got to survive this US onslaught against China, which is coming, which is, as I say, I've documented in my book, Has China Won? And they are focused on that. And so as a result of that, that creates opportunities for others. So it creates opportunities for Southeast Asia. Because in Southeast Asia, because China doesn't want Southeast Asia to become an anti-Chinese lake, the Chinese are doing their best to build win-win economic partnership with Southeast Asia. And I can guarantee you this, that if you can sit down and have a rational dialogue, where you've got to push aside your emotions for a while, you'll find that China will be very happy to work out a win-win arrangement with India too, for the same reason that they want to focus on the United States. And you're right to point out the major trade deficit between
Yeah.
US and within China and India. You're absolutely right. But there are ways and means of dealing with trade deficits. And, for example, when the United States was very worried about the major trade deficit with the Japanese, as you know, the United States and Japan had negotiations, and the Japanese agreed to what is called VERs, voluntary export restraints. So, that what I'm saying to you is there's no problem in the world is new. Every problem has got a precedent. And so you can find ways and means of dealing with it, and then take advantage of the larger market.
And there are questions on that, and I'll come to that. But if the Chinese are indeed indifferent to India, how do you explain this mass military buildup at the border with India? Well, why block sanctions against terror groups like the JUD and the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Lashkar, which is, this is a fight that's been happening over the years at the UN.
I completely agree with you. It's a huge mistake to block sanctions against terrorist groups. But as you know, I'm sorry to say this, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Exhibit A, Mandela. Mandela was called a terrorist by United States, as you know. But on the cases you mentioned, yes, it's unwise of China to block the designation of terrorist groups. I agree with you there.
Okay. Pradeep Arora on our live stream seems to sort of have your way of thinking and says, how should India use the differences between China and the United States to our advantage?
It's very simple. Be cunning. Be very cunning. See, geopolitics is not about being nice. It's about being cunning. It's as simple as that. And that's what great geopolitical thinkers are about. Henry Kissinger, George Kennan, they're very cunning. And how are they cunning? What is the best position India can be in this dispute? The best, if you can imagine a seesaw, okay? On one side, the seesaw is China. On the other side, the seesaw is United States, right? The seesaw is going like this. What's the best position for India to be in the middle? So wherever India puts its foot, the seesaw goes that way. And guess what? Both United States and China will be super nice to India. That's about being cunning.
What we have just witnessed was an exceptionally candid and tense intellectual exchange. It perfectly illustrates the great divide between India's emotional nationalism and Kishore Mahbubani's cold-blooded realism. Faced with the host's repeated questions on territorial sovereignty and China's expansionism, Professor Mahbubani offered a completely different set of solutions. He used the wisdom of Vietnam's ability to both stand up to China and get along with China, to contrast with India's rigidity. He used the West's hypocrisy and double standards on human rights to caution India against naively trusting external powers. And ultimately, he pointed India towards a cunning path of survival, to occupy the central, pivotal position on the seesaw of US-China competition. His core and repeated advice was this: if you want to succeed in geopolitics, the biggest mistake you can make is to be emotional. This profound dialogue leaves us with several questions to reflect on. First, is the pragmatic realism that Mahbubani describes one that is focused on self-interest and avoids being held hostage by historical sentiment, a form of unprincipled cynicism, or is it a higher form of survival wisdom in a cruel geopolitical world? Second, to what extent should a nation, in dealing with its powerful neighbors, prioritize domestic national sentiment and public opinion? And to what extent should it adhere to cold, hard calculations of national interest? And finally, and most critically, is the prescription that Mahbubani offered for India to set aside emotion, embrace openness, and play the cunning balancer between the US and China a viable strategy today, or is it an unrealistic ideal We are eager to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe this deep dialogue on the India-China relationship has provided you with valuable insight, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching. Thank you.